What the hell do you think you're doing?" The words were not just spoken. They were a detonation in the cathedral-like silence of the penthouse, a sound so sharp and out of place, it seemed to vibrate against the cold, polished marble under Alistair Finch's expensive shoes. He had come home a day early from a tense negotiation in Zurich, a victory that tasted like ash in his mouth, and all he wanted was the sterile, predictable solitude of his study and a glass of scotch that was older than most of the people he employed. He had expected to walk into the same oppressive quiet that had become the soundtrack to his life for the past year. The sound of a world that had been surgically muted, its vibrant, laughing heart silenced forever. He did not expect this. He did not expect to hear music, a soft, ethereal melody of a single cello, weaving its way through the vast, empty spaces, and beneath it, a woman's voice, a low, warm hum of pure, undiluted encouragement. A sound so fundamentally out of place, so achingly reminiscent of a maternal cadence he thought he'd never hear in these rooms again, that it felt like a physical blow. He froze in the archway of the grand living area, the burnished leather of his briefcase slipping from his numb fingers, landing on the floor with a dull, expensive thud that was swallowed by the vast, empty space. The sound was coming from the master bathroom. His heart, a sluggish, grief-heavy muscle, began a frantic, panicked tattoo against his ribs as he moved down the long, gallery-like hallway. The walls were lined with minimalist art, masterpieces that had once brought him a cool, intellectual pleasure. Now they were just shapes and shadows, as meaningless as the stock tickers scrolling endlessly on his phone. Each silent, urgent step was an accusation. Who had dared to bring sound, to bring life, back into this mausoleum? The bathroom door, a massive slab of frosted glass, was ajar, spilling a soft, warm, steamy light into the dim corridor. He pushed it open, his movements stiff with a sudden protective fury, and the world tilted on its axis, throwing him into a vertigo of disbelief and white-hot rage. There, in the center of the enormous sunken marble tub, sat his daughter, Serafina. His 6-year-old daughter, who had not walked, had not even willingly stood since the accident that had claimed her mother, was immersed in the warm, shimmering water. Her small, thin body, usually rigid with pain and fear, was pliant, relaxed. Her eyes were closed, a faint, serene smile on her lips. And kneeling on the bath mat beside the tub, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, was the new nanny, the one the agency had sent over 3 weeks ago, the latest in a long, failed procession of them. Clara Williams. Her dark skin glistened in the steamy air, her focus entirely on the child in the water. Her hands were submerged, gently, almost imperceptibly, guiding Serafina's frail legs through the water in a slow, graceful, dance-like motion, in perfect time, with the cello music playing softly from a small speaker on the counter. "That's it, sweet girl," Clara whispered, her voice a melody of pure, undiluted belief, a sound that felt as if it could coax flowers from stone. "Just let the water hold you. You are safe. You are so strong." Serafina, her entire small being focused on that voice, on that gentle touch, let out a soft, contented sigh. She was not just bathing. She was moving. She was healing. A hot, savage wave of possessive grief and primal rage crested inside Alistair. This moment. This sacred, private moment. It was a violation. His daughter, in this vulnerable state, with this stranger, engaged in some bizarre, New Age ritual he hadn't approved, hadn't even been consulted on. He didn't see therapy. He saw a trespass of the most intimate kind. He saw a stranger touching his most precious, broken thing. He didn't see a miracle of healing. He saw a desecration of his grief. Get away from her, Alistair snarled, his voice a low, dangerous growl that ripped through the peaceful, steamy air. He strode into the room, his shadow falling over them like a curse. The carefully constructed bubble of peace, effort, and trust shattered into a million pieces. Serafina's eyes flew open, the serene smile vanishing, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated terror. Her body, so relaxed moments before, went rigid, her muscles locking in a familiar spasm of fear. She began to cry, not the loud wail of a typical child, but a silent, choked, desperate sound, her small body trembling violently in the water. "I don't care what the agency told you to do," Alistair seethed, his furious, grief-stricken gaze finally landing on Clara. He took in her simple navy blue uniform, the way her hair was pulled back neatly from a face that was now pale with shock, but not fear. "Your job is to monitor her medication and her meals. You are not here to play doctor. You are not her mother." The words were designed to be weapons, each one dipped in the concentrated poison of his own unrelenting pain, and he hurled them at her with the brutal precision of a man determined to make someone else feel the agony he lived with every day. He saw her flinch, a subtle, almost imperceptible tightening of her shoulders, but her eyes, when they met his, held no terror. They held a quiet, devastating clarity that infuriated him even more. "It's called hydrotherapy," she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the tense silence with the clean edge of truth. "It's a recognized physical therapy technique. It reduces the weight on her joints. It helps with pain and muscle memory." She was making progress. The simplicity of her statement, the sheer, unassailable logic of it, was a denial of his grief's supremacy. It was an invalidation of the narrative that his loss was so profound, so all-consuming, that no healing was possible without his express permission. It was unacceptable. "You're fired," Alistair snapped, the words a reflex, a desperate, clumsy attempt to regain control of a world, a room, a single moment that had spun so beautifully and painfully out of his grasp. He turned from her, reaching into the tub to lift his crying, struggling daughter into his arms. "Get out of my house. Now!" Serafina only cried harder, her small body stiff and unyielding in his arms. He was trying to wrap her in a towel, but she was fighting him, her eyes still desperately searching for the calm, safe harbor of Clara's presence. Alistair tried to soothe her, murmuring the empty, hollow platitudes of a man speaking a language his heart no longer remembered. "Shh, Daddy's here. It's okay, Sarah." But his touch was wrong, too tight, too tense. His voice was a foreign, frightening sound in the desolate landscape of his daughter's grief. Clara stood for a long, silent moment, a statue of profound stillness in the center of the chaos he had created. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She simply gave a single, slow nod, a gesture of such profound and wounded dignity that it would replay in his mind, a silent accusation, for days to come. Then she turned and walked out of the room, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the heated marble floor. She left Alistair Finch utterly alone, clutching the trembling, heartbreaking evidence of a wound he had just made infinitely, unforgivably deeper. The hours that followed were a masterclass in a special, gilded kind of hell, the kind reserved for powerful, intelligent men rendered utterly and comprehensively powerless. Alistair, a titan of private equity who could orchestrate complex international acquisitions and dismantle entire corporations with a single dispassionate phone call, found himself comprehensively defeated by the unyielding silent grief of his 6-year-old daughter. Serafina's silent cries did not subside. they became a visceral, physical force within the penthouse, a presence that seemed to make the very air vibrate with sorrow and fear. She refused her dinner. She refused the warm milk Mrs. Gable prepared. She sat rigidly in her bed, her small body a knot of tension, her gaze fixed on a single empty point on the wall. Alistair tried to read to her, his voice clumsy and hollow, as he stumbled through the familiar lines of her favorite storybook, but she showed no sign of hearing him. He was a ghost in his own daughter's room. He sat with her for hours, the vast, empty spaces of the penthouse amplifying his own cavernous inadequacy. He looked around the room, at the soft, pastel colors, the shelves of untouched toys, the beautiful, hand-painted mural of a whimsical forest that his wife, Eleanor, had spent a month creating. It was a perfect child's room, a perfect, beautiful cage. It was only when sheer, gut-wrenching exhaustion finally claimed her that Seraphina's rigid posture softened, and she fell into a fitful, whimpering sleep. Alistair, his own body trembling with a fatigue that was more soul-deep than physical, carefully pulled the covers up to her chin. He stood over her for a long time, watching the unsteady rise and fall of her small chest, and the oppressive silence that descended in the wake of the storm felt more like a surrender than a relief. It was then, in the dim, warm glow of the nursery's starlight projector, that he noticed it for the first time. It was a small, spiral-bound notebook left neatly on the bedside table. He picked it up with a sense of trepidation. Inside, Clara's neat, precise handwriting filled the pages. It was a log, a meticulous, patient charting of impossibly small, incremental victories. A grid of dates, each marked with simple, hand-drawn smiley faces for good days and neutral faces for challenging ones, accompanied by concise, clinical, yet deeply compassionate notes. April 12th. Responded positively to the cello suite. Allowed me to massage her legs for 5 minutes without tensing. A good day. April 14th. Showed interest in the water. We sat by the tub and just listened to the sound. She dipped her fingers in. Progress. April 16th. Agreed to get in the tub with the music playing. Her body relaxed almost instantly in the water. She smiled. A real smile. This wasn't just a record of duties performed. It was a map of resurrection, a testament to a quiet, patient, unwavering faith he hadn't even known was being practiced under his own roof. He walked back into the living area, the notebook clutched in his hand as if it were a holy text. The silence was different now. It wasn't empty. It was heavy with the weight of what he had just broken. Mrs. Gable, the estate's longtime housekeeper, a woman of 60 with a quiet, almost monastic dignity and eyes that missed nothing, was standing by the grand piano. She wasn't cleaning, she was simply standing there, a silent sentinel, as if waiting. Mrs. Gable had been with the Finch family for 30 years. She had served Alistair's formidable father, had seen Alistair grow from a stiff, awkward boy into a ruthless businessman, had held Eleanor's veil on her wedding day. She was less an employee and more a permanent, silent witness to the entire Finch family history, its triumphs and its shames. "The child is finally quiet, sir," Mrs. Gable said, her voice perfectly neutral, betraying nothing, yet her very stillness was a form of profound judgment. "She worked with her every single day," the housekeeper continued, her gaze fixed on a distant point beyond the glittering city lights. She did not wait for Alistair to prompt him. She said the water made her feel weightless, that it was the only place the pain seemed to go away. She was a physical therapist, you know, or was studying to be one, before she had to leave to care for her sister. Each word was a small, sharp stone, methodically dismantling the crumbling edifice of Alistair's righteous anger. He had never asked about her background. The agency file had been a blur of text he'd scanned in 30 seconds while closing a deal. He saw her name, Clara Williams, and noted her race with the detached, systemic bias he wasn't even aware he possessed. She was the nanny. Temporary, a functional object in the sprawling, broken apparatus of his new life. She told me the body remembers trauma in every cell, Mrs. Gable added, her voice dropping slightly, becoming almost confidential. But she believed the heart could be taught to remember the joy that came before it. Alistair's throat constricted, the feeling of suffocation returning. His anger, so hot and certain just hours ago, had cooled into a sickening, icy dread. He thought of her face in the bathroom, the quiet dignity in her eyes as he'd spat those venomous, unforgivable words at her. "You are not her mother." He had intended it to be the ultimate wound, a final, brutal assertion of his own pain's supremacy. And it was. But he realized now, with a clarity that was itself a form of agony, that the wound was his own. He was the absent one, the one who had retreated into the cold, sterile fortress of his work, leaving his daughter to navigate the aftershocks of a world-shattering tragedy with a revolving door of well-paid, emotionally distant strangers. Clara hadn't been a stranger. She had been the one who stayed, the one who saw, the one who believed in the possibility of joy after the apocalypse. He walked back to Serafina's room, the notebook feeling as heavy as a tombstone in his hand. He looked at the last entry again, at the single, hopeful, heartbreaking phrase she had written at the bottom of the page. Today, she kicked her legs to the music. On her own. Shame, hot and absolute, burned in his chest. He had walked in on a miracle in progress, and had not just failed to recognize it. He had actively, brutally, and perhaps irrevocably destroyed it. Serafina's profound regression was swift and terrifyingly absolute. The following morning, she woke not with the low-grade fever of a simple illness, but with the chilling, silent fever of a spirit in retreat. She was no longer just in pain. She was hermetically sealed in a bubble of trauma, unresponsive and unreachable. She refused the breakfast tray Mrs. Gable brought up, pushing it away with a weak but determined hand, her lips pressed into a thin, white line. When Alistair, his heart aching with a desperate, clumsy tenderness, tried to hold her, she flinched away as if from a hot flame, her small body going rigid with a fear that was primal and deeply ingrained. Her gaze, once bright and curious, was now dull and fixed on the doorway of her room, a constant, silent, heartbreaking vigil. She was waiting, and the person she was waiting for was not him. Her pediatric rheumatologist, Dr. Peterson, a brisk, no-nonsense woman in her 50s, with eyes that seemed to see straight through Alistair's polished facade, arrived just before noon. She took one look at Serafina, her professional composure tightening into a deep, concerned frown. Her examination was quick, her findings delivered with the blunt force of a diagnosis that was also a clear and damning indictment. "This isn't a medical issue, Mr. Finch," she said, her voice sharp and unforgiving as she packed her medical bag with efficient snaps and clicks. "This is a profound emotional regression. It's trauma, and it's acute. Whatever psychological stability this child had managed to painstakingly build has been completely and utterly shattered. She's retreating into herself as a defense mechanism, and if we don't intervene effectively, this could cause permanent developmental damage." She looked at Alistair over the rim of her glasses, her gaze holding him accountable. The previous caregiver, The one the agency informed me you dismissed yesterday. I reviewed her detailed notes this morning. They indicated significant, almost miraculous progress with her pain management and mobility. What, precisely, happened here? Alistair, the titan of industry, the man whose confident pronouncements moved global markets and graced the covers of financial magazines, could not form the words. He couldn't bring himself to confess the simple, ugly, unforgivable truth. I walked in on my daughter's first real steps toward healing since my wife's death, and punished the woman who made them possible. He just shook his head, the lie he was about to tell feeling like sandpaper in his throat. It was a misunderstanding. Dr. Peterson's expression morphed into a mask of pure clinical disdain. Well, I suggest you understand this, Mr. Finch. Your daughter is in an extremely fragile and precarious state. She requires absolute consistency, and more than anything else in the world, a primary attachment figure she trusts implicitly. And right now, that person is very clearly not you. Her words were a clinical vivisection of his failure as a father, each one methodically cutting away another layer of his pride and self-delusion. After she left, the penthouse was suffocating in its silence, the quiet, a mocking echo of the life and hope that had briefly filled it. Alistair stood alone in the center of the vast living room, the doctor's brutal assessment ringing in his ears. He had to fix this. Not with money, not with a new team of world-renowned specialists flown in from Switzerland, but with the one currency he had so arrogantly and foolishly discarded: humility. He found the agency's number in his contacts and dialed, his hand shaking so badly he almost dropped the phone. The administrator on the other end, a woman with a cool, professional voice, was polite but firm, citing a litany of privacy policies and employee protection clauses. But the voice Alistair used was not the one of command and power he typically employed. It was the raw, frayed voice of a desperate, broken father. "I need to find Clara Williams," he said, his own voice tight with a shame that was almost choking him. "Please, I have made a terrible, terrible mistake." It took another 10 minutes of what amounted to pleading, but they finally relented. They gave him an address. The address was for a walk-up in a part of the city his car's sophisticated navigation system barely recognized as habitable. He drove himself, the sleek, silent black lines of the Bentley, a stark alien presence on the narrow, gray street lined with aging brick buildings, their fire escapes tracing rusty patterns against the sky. He found her apartment on the 3rd floor of a building where the hallway smelled of old paint, damp plaster, and the faint, lingering aroma of fried onions. He stood outside her door for a full minute, his heart pounding a frantic, unsteady rhythm. 100 different speeches rehearsed and discarded a dozen times in his mind. He finally knocked, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet hall. When she opened the door, her eyes widened for a split second in pure, unadulterated surprise, then quickly settled into a careful, guarded neutrality that was more impenetrable than any wall. She was dressed in simple jeans and a faded university sweatshirt, her hair loose and curling softly around her shoulders. Behind her, he could see neatly stacked and labeled cardboard boxes. She was packing. She was leaving. "Mr. Finch." "Clara," he began, the name feeling foreign and rough in his mouth. I came to apologize." She didn't speak, didn't invite him in. She just waited, her arms crossed in a subtle, protective barrier that spoke volumes. "What I said, how I acted, there is no excuse for it." "None," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "I was wrong." He took a ragged breath, the simple act of exhaling feeling like a monumental effort. "I saw a moment that I believed was private, sacred. and I was blinded by my own selfish, possessive grief. I didn't see what you were doing. I didn't see you. A flicker of emotion, perhaps pain, perhaps surprise, passed over her face, but it was gone as quickly as it came, her mask of composure firmly back in place. "Serafina is not doing well," he said, his voice finally breaking, the confession costing him more than any failed business deal ever had. She's retreated. She won't let me near her. She needs you." "She needs her father," Clara corrected, her voice soft, but not without a sharp, clean edge of truth. "She has a father who doesn't know how to reach her," Alistair admitted, the raw truth of it stripping away the last, tattered vestiges of his pride. "Please, come back. I'm not asking you to be her nanny. I'm asking you to be her lead therapist, her case manager. You will have full, unmitigated authority. You can hire your own team if you think it's necessary. You'll have an unlimited research budget. Whatever you need, just name your price." Clara finally looked up, her gaze searching his, looking past the expensive suit and the desperate, extravagant offer. She was looking for the truth behind the words, for the crack in the armor, for the genuine heart of his regret. "It's not about a title or a salary, Mr. Finch," she said, her voice impossibly calm and steady. "If I come back, it is only for her, and it will be on my terms." He nodded immediately, desperately, a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled his knees. "Anything." "One condition," she said, her voice gaining a new, unshakable firmness that he had never heard before. "You have to be there, in the room, for at least one full session, every single day. No phones, no emails, no excuses. You don't get to outsource her healing anymore, Alistair. You have to be part of it." A long, heavy silence stretched between them. The ambient sounds of the city, a distant siren, the rumble of a passing train, filtering up from the street below. Alistair held her gaze, and for the first time since Eleanor's death, he felt a flicker of something other than the crushing, monolithic weight of loss. It was a terrifying, fragile, and utterly unfamiliar hope. "I will," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. "I'll be there." Clara's return to the Finch estate was not a quiet, deferential re-entry. It was a fundamental recalibration of the entire household's emotional and logistical ecosystem. She arrived the next morning, not with a small, worn duffel bag, but with two large, heavy cases filled with a curated collection of therapeutic equipment. Sensory mats, weighted blankets, specialized hydrotherapy tools, and a waterproof speaker for the bathroom. She walked in not with a nanny's deference or a caregiver's quiet compliance, but with the unshakable authority of a specialist taking command of a critical, time-sensitive situation. Her first meeting was not with Alistair, but with Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, in the cavernous, gleaming expanse of the kitchen. She laid out her terms, her voice calm and clear, but with an underlying steel that left no room for negotiation or misinterpretation. Serafina's daily schedule, which had been a loose, grief-stricken approximation of normalcy, would now be paramount. It would be rigorously structured around 90-minute blocks of what she called somatic and aquatic-based play in the morning, sensory integration exercises after her nap, and consistent, gentle exposure to new tactile and auditory stimuli. The oppressive silence that had become the home's default state was to be replaced, she declared, with the soft ambient strains of cello and piano music, Bach and Debussy, specifically, which she explained, in a tone that brooked no argument, helped to soothe an overstimulated nervous system and promote a sense of calm and safety. Mrs. Gable, who had witnessed Serafina's heartbreaking decline firsthand, received these directives not with resentment, but with a subtle, deeply approving nod. She had seen the state of the child. She recognized a lifeline when she saw one. The first session with Alistair was a masterclass in excruciating, profound awkwardness. He arrived in Serafina's playroom at precisely 10:20 a.m., as instructed, dressed in his usual bespoke suit of charcoal gray, looking as out of place as an orchid in a desert. He sat stiffly on the edge of the plush, cream-colored carpet, a man accustomed to commanding boardrooms from a throne of Italian leather now perched uncomfortably on the floor of his daughter's room. He watched, silent and tense, as Clara guided Serafina through a series of simple, rhythmic breathing exercises, her focus entirely on the child. Her autoimmune response is exacerbated by stress, which creates a feedback loop of pain and anxiety, Clara explained, her tone clinical but not cold, her hands gently resting on Serafina's small shoulders. We have to re-regulate her nervous system before we can even begin to address the physical symptoms. She needs to feel safe in her own body again. Alistair just nodded, his hands clasped so tightly between his knees that his knuckles were white, a titan of industry reduced to a silent, uncertain, and utterly useless observer. He watched the way she moved, her touch firm but infinitely gentle, her voice a constant, soothing murmur that seemed to weave a protective, invisible barrier around the girl. He saw the way Serafina's tense little body, which had been as rigid as a board in his own arms, would slowly, almost imperceptibly, relax and yield to her touch. For the first 2 days, that was the full extent of his mandated involvement, watching from the periphery, a ghost at the edge of his own daughter's healing. He felt a profound sense of uselessness, a feeling so foreign and unwelcome it was almost physically painful. The breakthrough, if one could call something so small and fragile a breakthrough, came on the 3rd day. The air in the playroom was thick with the scent of rain from a passing afternoon shower. Clara had brought out a large, shallow tub of kinetic sand, a strange, mesmerizing substance that moved like a liquid, but felt like soft, cool sand. She wasn't teaching Serafina how to build anything, she was simply encouraging her to touch it, to explore the texture. Serafina was hesitant, her fingers barely brushing the smooth, cool surface. After a moment of intense, trembling effort, she plunged her whole hand in, a small, surprised gasp escaping her lips. Then she did it again. And again. A simple, silent exploration of sensation. Alistair watched, holding his breath. He saw a flicker of the old, curious, joyful Serafina he thought he had lost forever. He felt a complex, painful knot of grief, frustration, and inadequacy begin to loosen in his chest. He was witnessing a language beyond words, a conversation built on a foundation of patience and radical acceptance. He was learning. Weeks turned into a month, the days marked by the slow, steady rhythm of this fragile, sacred routine. Alistair began to anticipate the daily sessions, not with dread, but with a quiet, intense curiosity. He found himself rearranging international conference calls and pushing back deadlines to ensure he was there, on the floor, at 10 a.m. sharp. He learned the names of Serafina's favorite songs, simple, gentle melodies that Clara would play on her phone. He learned that Serafina was soothed by the scent of lavender and the texture of velvet. He learned that her favorite color was the specific shade of purple in the evening sky just after the sun had set. One gray afternoon, Clara was helping Serafina stand, her small body supported between 2 low, padded chairs. Serafina was wobbly, her legs trembling with the effort. She started to lose her balance. Alistair, who was sitting nearby, ostensibly reading a financial report, but in reality watching their every move, lunged forward without a single conscious thought. His hand shot out to steady Serafina's back at the exact same instant as Clara's. Their hands brushed, his large calloused from years of gripping golf clubs and shaking hands on multi-million-dollar deals, hers smaller, softer, but with a surprising, sinewy strength. It was a small, fleeting touch, but the jolt of it, the shared, instinctive parental act of protection, was electric. A current of warmth, of an unspoken, profound connection, lingered in the air between them long after they both pulled their hands away as if burned. Clara felt a hot flush creep up her neck, and she immediately, professionally, turned her attention back to Serafina, her voice a little breathless. "Good save, Sarah Bug. You're getting so strong." Alistair cleared his throat and stepped back, the intensity of the moment broken, but not forgotten. He looked at their two hands, then back at his daughter, who was now standing, safely supported between them. They were no longer just an employer and his specialist, locked in a contractual arrangement. They were two people, tethered by love and loss to the same small, fragile center of gravity. A girl who was finally, painstakingly, learning to stand on her own again. The fragile, carefully constructed piece of the Thorne estate, a delicate ecosystem of therapy sessions, shared glances, and quiet, incremental progress, was shattered by the unexpected, unannounced arrival of Catherine Davenport, Alistair's late wife's older sister. She did not call ahead. She did not wait to be announced by Mrs. Gable. She swept into the lobby of the building like a winter storm front, dressed in an impeccably tailored navy blue suit that seemed to absorb all the light in the room. Her blonde hair was styled in a severe, formidable bob, and her eyes, a pale, icy blue, were as sharp and cold as the diamonds glittering at her ears. Catherine was a senior partner at a prestigious law firm, a woman who did not ask for permission. She simply took possession of any room she entered, and the Thorne estate, the home of her only niece, was, in her mind, fundamentally her territory. She found them in the sunroom, which had become Serafina's primary therapy space. It was a scene of quiet, focused, domestic industry. Alistair, his suit jacket discarded and sleeves rolled to his elbows, was on the floor, helping Serafina fit large, chunky pieces into a wooden puzzle. Clara knelt beside them, coaching the girl softly, her finger gently guiding Serafina's small hand toward the correct shape. Catherine stopped dead in the doorway, her manicured hand flying to her throat in a gesture of pure, theatrical horror. Her gaze swept over the scene, her expression a mask of undisguised revulsion. The carefully maintained facade of high society composure cracked, revealing the raw, possessive grief that churned beneath. "Alistair, what is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice dripping with an icy disdain that made the warm, sunlit air feel suddenly frigid. Her eyes flickered to Clara, appraising and dismissing her in a single, brutal glance, as one might an intrusive, poorly chosen piece of furniture that had inexplicably appeared in a priceless showroom. "Auntie Kate," Serafina chirped, her small face lighting up with the innocent, uncomplicated delight of a child seeing a familiar face. Catherine's severe expression softened for a fraction of a second as she looked at her niece, a flicker of genuine, fierce love in her cold eyes. But the warmth vanished the instant her gaze returned to Clara, her expression hardening once more into a mask of contempt. "I was under the impression," she said, her words aimed squarely at Alistair like poisoned darts, "that you had hired a qualified team of professionals, psychologists, physical therapists, to oversee Serafina's care." Her tone made it unequivocally clear that the woman on the floor with her niece was not included in that esteemed category. "This is Clara Williams, Catherine," Alistair said, rising slowly to his feet, his own posture stiffening in response to her attack. She is Serafina's primary caregiver and developmental specialist. Catherine arched a perfectly sculpted eyebrow, the gesture a masterclass in condescension. Specialist? The placement agency I contacted for a reference informed me you had hired a temporary caregiver, a young woman of color with an incomplete education. The dismissive description hung in the air, ugly and sharp and dissonant in the cheerful sunroom. Alistair's jaw tightened, a muscle pulsing rhythmically in his cheek. Her qualifications are impeccable, her results are undeniable, and her race is entirely irrelevant. Is it? Catherine countered, stepping fully into the room, her presence, her expensive perfume, her aura of monolithic self-assurance dominating the space. I find it highly irregular that this woman has been given such an intimate and influential role in my niece's life. A child in her delicate condition, Alistair, needs stability. She needs familiarity. She needs family. The implication was a stiletto, sharp, thin, and aimed directly at Clara's heart. Clara was not family. She was an outsider, an interloper, a temporary fixture who had overstepped her bounds. Clara, who had remained silent and still throughout this exchange, her hand resting protectively on Serafina's small back, now straightened her spine. She did not rise to her feet. That would be a concession of her place on the floor with Serafina, a retreat from her rightful position beside her. She simply looked up, her gaze direct and unclouded by fear. "With all due respect, Mrs. Davenport," she said, her voice quiet but imbued with an unshakable firmness that seemed to surprise even Alistair. "Serafina's condition has improved so dramatically precisely because she has had stability. I have been with her every day, for every small struggle and every tiny victory. That is the very definition of familiarity. And you believe that gives you some sort of claim on her?" Catherine scoffed, her lip curling in a faint, ugly sneer. "I believe it gives me a deep and accurate understanding of what this child needs," Clara replied, her voice remaining level, her gaze unflinching. "And right now, she needs patience and trust. She does not need a disruption caused by prejudice and a misplaced sense of ownership." A tense, profound silence ensued, the air in the room crackling with the electricity of unspoken histories and raw, colliding griefs. Alistair, caught between the formidable iron will of his late wife's sister and his new, fragile but fiercely protective trust in Clara, finally found his voice. And the man who spoke was not the hesitant, grieving father of weeks past, but the decisive leader he was in the boardroom. "Catherine," he said, his tone quiet, but leaving no room for negotiation or appeal. "Clara has my full and complete confidence. She stays." Catherine's eyes narrowed into slits of cold blue fury. "Then you leave me no choice," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "I will not stand by and watch my sister's daughter be raised by an unqualified, opportunistic stranger. I am speaking to my lawyers this afternoon. I will file for temporary guardianship, citing an unsafe and unstable home environment. We will see what a family court judge has to say about this arrangement." With that final, devastating pronouncement, she turned on her heel and swept out of the room, leaving a vortex of chilling silence in her wake. The threat hung in the air, heavy and real and immediate. Alistair ran a hand through his hair, his face pale and drawn. "She's not bluffing," he said quietly, his voice hollow with the certainty of the coming storm. "She will do it." Clara looked down at Serafina, who, sensing the seismic shift in the room's emotional landscape, had crawled fully into her lap, her small face buried in the soft fabric of her shirt, her arms wrapped tightly around her waist. The world had just shrunk again, the protective walls of the estate closing in. The fight for Serafina's future wasn't just about healing her past anymore. It was about to become a war for her present, and Clara knew with a sudden, chilling clarity that she was standing at the very center of the battlefield. Catherine Davenport's threat of a protracted, ugly custody battle threw Alistair and Clara into a forced, intense, and profoundly intimate alliance. The estate, which had just begun to feel like a space of quiet, therapeutic healing, transformed overnight into a strategic command center for a war they hadn't chosen but were now compelled to fight. Lawyers, their faces grim and their voices a low, constant murmur of legal precedents and strategic options, came and went. The grand, echoing dining room table, once reserved for silent, solitary meals, was now permanently littered with stacks of legal documents, depositions from former staff, and child psychology textbooks that were underlined and flagged with dozens of colored sticky notes. In this new, high-stakes arena, Alistair was a different man. The cold, decisive CEO, the one who had been softened and humbled in the quiet of the sunroom, re-emerged. But his focus this time was not on profit margins or market share. It was on the singular, ruthless, and all-consuming goal of protecting his daughter from being torn apart. He and Clara worked late into the night, every night, a strange, sleep-deprived team fueled by endless pots of black coffee and a shared, desperate purpose. He handled the intricate legal strategy, his mind sharp and analytical as he dissected precedents from similar cases and drafted blistering affidavits. She, in turn, became the chief architect of their defense's core argument, meticulously compiling the overwhelming evidence of Serafina's progress. She organized her daily logs into a comprehensive timeline, edited hours of video clips that showed her staggering improvement in mobility and speech, and created detailed charts that tracked her pain levels and medication needs, which had both decreased significantly under her care. It was in one of these late-night sessions, surrounded by the ghosts of his wife's art history books in the vast, silent library, that Alistair's carefully constructed armor of professional detachment finally, completely, cracked. He was staring into an untouched glass of amber whiskey, the crystal catching the low, warm light of the desk lamp, when he spoke, his voice so low that Clara had to lean in to hear him over the soft rustle of her papers. "Catherine blames me for what happened to Isabella," he said, the words heavy, as if he were pulling them up from a deep, dark well. "She's convinced I didn't do enough to save her." Clara looked up from the report she was annotating, her pen pausing mid-sentence. The air in the room grew still. "What do you mean?" she asked gently. "Isabella's arthritis. It was a rare, aggressive variant. The doctors said it was manageable, not curable. She was a fighter. She was a dancer before we met. She refused to let it define her," he said, a bitter, self-deprecating laugh catching in his throat. "She was so full of life. When she got pregnant with Serafina, she was ecstatic. But the pregnancy accelerated the disease. The pain became constant. I threw money at the problem. The best specialists, experimental treatments, private nurses. I thought I could buy her a cure." He swirled the whiskey in his glass, the ice clinking softly. The end came so fast. An infection. Her immune system was too compromised. It took her in 3 days. His voice finally broke, a raw, ragged sound of a wound that had never been allowed to heal. "Catherine thinks that if I had been a different kind of husband, if I had pushed for more aggressive treatment sooner, if I had found the right doctor, she'd still be here." He finally looked at Clara, his eyes stripped bare, raw with a grief he had never allowed anyone to witness before. "And the hell of it is, maybe she's right. A long, profound silence filled the room, broken only by the soft, distant hum of the city that never slept, far below them. Clara chose her words with the care and precision of a surgeon tending to a vital artery. "You can't carry the weight of a disease, Alistair. It wasn't a choice. It was a tragedy. That weight is not yours to carry." She watched him, saw the flicker of protest, of ingrained guilt in his eyes, and she made a decision. It was time to build a different, more profound kind of bridge between them, one built not on a shared purpose, but on shared pain. "I lost someone too," she said, her voice dropping to a soft, confidential whisper. "My younger sister, Chloe. She had cerebral palsy. I was in my final year of my physical therapy program at Columbia, a full scholarship. I was arrogant." She took a shaky breath. "I thought I knew better than her doctors. I thought I could manage her care myself, that my love would be enough. I was the expert." Tears she hadn't shed in years, tears she had locked away behind a wall of professional competence, burned hot behind her eyes. I ignored the signs that she was getting worse. I told myself it was just a temporary setback. I was so focused on my own ability to fix her that I didn't see that she was slipping away, until it was too late. She looked down at her hands, which were clenched so tightly in her lap that her nails dug into her palms. "I left my program a week after her funeral. I left because I couldn't bear the thought of being responsible for another life. I felt like a fraud. For a very long time, I believed her death was my fault, my punishment for my pride." Alistair stared at her, the vast, unbridgeable gulf between them, of wealth, of race, of life experience, suddenly, completely vanishing. It was replaced by the universal, desolate, and achingly familiar landscape of grief and guilt. In that moment, they were not a billionaire and his daughter's caregiver. They were just two people, haunted by the relentless, whispering ghosts of what-ifs. It was in that moment of shared, devastating vulnerability that their alliance was truly and irrevocably forged. It was no longer a professional arrangement of convenience or necessity. It was a bond, deep and resonant, sealed in the quiet, sacred understanding of shared, unbearable loss. The next morning, driven by this new, unspoken intimacy and a desperate search for anything that might help their case, Clara was looking for a specific file on Serafina's early medical history in Isabella's old art studio, a sun-drenched room filled with canvases and the scent of turpentine that Alistair had kept locked. A perfect, untouched shrine until now. It was on a high, dusty shelf, tucked away behind a stack of art supply catalogs, that she found them. A set of 5, matching, leather-bound sketchbooks. They weren't filled with landscapes or still lifes. They were visual diaries. Her heart pounded a nervous rhythm against her ribs as she carefully took one down and opened it. Isabella's elegant, confident drawings filled the pages. She had documented her life, her love for Alistair, her deep and boundless excitement for Serafina's arrival, but also, threaded through the hopeful, joyful images, was a subtle, persistent current of deep-seated fear, a fear of her sister's judgment, a fear of her illness stealing her daughter's childhood. One drawing depicted a beautiful, vibrant woman trapped inside a glass box, her hands pressed against the invisible walls. But it was the last sketchbook, the one from the final, harrowing weeks before her death, that held the key. Clara's hands trembled as she found the final unfinished sketch. Her breath caught in her throat. It was a portrait, rendered in soft charcoal lines, of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, a woman who looked strikingly like Clara, holding the hand of a small, radiant child who was dancing. On the bottom of the page, in Isabella's elegant looping script, were the words, "Find the woman with the music in her hands. She will teach our daughter how to dance again." Clara sank into the artist's stool, the sketchbook clutched tightly in her hands, hot tears blurring the soft charcoal lines. Isabella had known. She had seen her, somehow, in a dream, a premonition, a desperate mother's prayer. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a legacy, an inheritance of trust, passed from one mother to another across the veil of death itself. The mediation was held in a sterile, soulless conference room on the 40th floor of a downtown law office, a place of polished mahogany and hushed, expensive silence designed to bleach all emotion from human conflict. Catherine Davenport sat on one side of the vast table, flanked by two sharp-suited lawyers who radiated an aura of predatory competence. She was the very picture of bereaved, righteous indignation. On the other side sat Alistair, with Clara directly beside him. Her presence was not a provocation, it was a silent, powerful declaration of their united, unshakable front. Catherine's lead lawyer, a man with silver hair and a voice as smooth as aged whiskey, began. He painted a masterful, condescending picture of a grieving, overwhelmed single father, a man so consumed by his work that he had recklessly outsourced his most sacred parental duties to an unlicensed, unvetted, and dangerously opportunistic caregiver. He presented glossy, artfully framed photographs of Clara's modest apartment building, highlighted her failure to complete her physical therapy degree, and systematically questioned her qualifications with surgical precision. "This woman, Your Honor," he concluded, his voice resonating with a dramatic, practiced gravitas, "is a risk, a dangerous, unknown variable that my client, in her profound love for her only niece, is simply not willing to accept." When it was their turn, Alistair spoke first, but his strategy was a shocking, brilliant departure from the aggressive defense his own lawyers had meticulously prepared. He didn't defend himself. He confessed. "For the first year after my wife's death, I was not the father my daughter, Serafina, deserved," he said, his voice clear and steady, resonating with the quiet, irrefutable power of unvarnished truth. "I was lost in my own grief. I was absent. And in many ways, I failed her." He turned his gaze directly to Catherine, not with anger, but with a look of profound, sorrowful acknowledgement. "You were right to be concerned. I was concerned." Okay, he paused, allowing the weight of his admission to settle in the silent room, then turned his body slightly, a subtle but significant gesture of inclusion and partnership toward Clara. "But then, I did the one thing my late wife, Isabella, asked of me. I found the person she instructed me to find." With a calm, deliberate movement, he slid a document across the polished surface of the table. It was a high-resolution, certified copy of Isabella's final, damning sketch. Catherine's lawyer picked it up, his confident, predatory smirk faltering as he read the words. Catherine leaned over, her own eyes scanning the familiar, elegant handwriting of her sister. A small, sharp, involuntary gasp escaped her lips, a tiny, heartbreaking sound of shock and utter disbelief in the quiet room. "Isabella chose Clara," Alistair said softly. "She knew Serafina would need someone with a specific gift, a specific kind of strength. And, as always, she was right." Then it was Clara's turn to speak. She didn't rise to her feet. She remained seated, her posture radiating a calm, centered strength that seemed to quiet the very air in the room. She didn't speak of her qualifications or her therapeutic methods. She spoke of Serafina. She described the little girl she had first met, a child encased in a fortress of silence, withdrawn and profoundly afraid of a world that had taken everything from her. And then, her voice softening, she described the girl she was becoming. Curious, brave, a child who was starting to laugh again, a child who was learning to trust that the world would not always break beneath her feet. She had brought Isabella's other sketchbooks with her. She opened one, its leather cover worn and soft. Isabella didn't fear motherhood, Clara said, her voice gentle but firm, as she looked directly at Catherine, a look not of accusation, but of shared, tragic understanding. She feared that your expectations of what a mother should be would suffocate her, just as those same fears were beginning to suffocate her daughter. Serafina doesn't need to be protected in a gilded cage, Mrs. Davenport. She needs the freedom to stumble, and the profound safety of knowing that someone will always, always be there to help her stand up again. She closed the sketchbook softly. That is what I have given her. It is what her mother wanted for her, and it is what her father is now, every single day, learning with courage and humility to give him, too. The room was utterly, profoundly silent. Catherine stared at the copied sketch, then at Clara, then at her brother-in-law. The icy armor of her righteousness, so carefully and painfully constructed over a year of grief and anger, began to crack. Beneath it was not a monster, but a grieving sister, terrified of losing the last living piece of her beloved Isabella. Tears, hot and unexpected, welled in her eyes. She never told me," Catherine whispered, her voice breaking, the sound of a heart shattering in the quiet, sterile room. "She never told me she felt that way." The fight was over. Later that evening, after Catherine had tearfully and formally withdrawn her guardianship petition, Alistair found Clara standing on the penthouse balcony. The city lights glittered below them like a vast, fallen constellation. "Isabella's sketchbooks," he said, coming to stand beside her, his voice filled with a quiet, reverent awe. "You were her voice today." "I just showed them her heart," Clara replied, her gaze fixed on the distant, dark horizon. "You gave it life," he insisted. He reached out, his hand gently, tentatively, covering hers where it rested on the cool metal of the railing. "She entrusted her to you, and now I am, too." He pulled a folded legal document from the inner pocket of his jacket. It was an updated page from his last will and testament. He had spent the entire afternoon with his lawyers. He had amended the guardianship clause. It now read, "In the event of my death or incapacitation, full and sole guardianship of my daughter, Serafina Finch, is to be granted to Clara Williams, who has proven herself to be a protector of her well-being and a steward of her mother's most sacred legacy." "Alistair, she started, her voice thick with an overwhelming wave of emotion. "This isn't a contract, Clara," he said, his eyes searching hers in the soft, ambient glow of the city. "It's a promise. You are her family. You are our family." She didn't pull her hand away, and in the quiet of the night, high above the sleeping city, two fractured souls and one little girl were no longer just surviving a tragedy. They were beginning, together, to build a home. A new kind of quiet, one that was peaceful, organic, and alive, settled into the Finch estate in the weeks following the seismic mediation. It wasn't the sterile, empty silence of profound, unarticulated grief, but the gentle, humming stillness of a life being painstakingly, lovingly rebuilt. The sound of Serafina's hesitant, happy laughter, once a shocking rarity, now filled the rooms. She would follow Clara from the sunroom to the kitchen, a small, determined shadow, narrating her world in a charming, chaotic patchwork of single words and newly formed two-word phrases. Clara, play. Sarah, draw. Daddy, home. Each utterance was a small, precious miracle, a testament to the deep, foundational healing that was taking root in the home's wounded heart. The victory against Catherine had not been a triumph of conquest, but a painful, necessary, and ultimately graceful realignment of their shattered family. She had begun visiting twice a week, no longer as a formidable matriarch inspecting her territory, but as a grandmother, tentative, humble, and learning. She would sit on the floor, her impeccably tailored suit a stark, beautiful contrast to the colorful chaos of Serafina's toy blocks. And she would listen, really, truly listen, as Clara guided the girl through her exercises. One afternoon, as Serafina successfully built a teetering tower of 5 blocks for the very first time, Catherine turned to Clara, her eyes holding a sad, clear, and profound wisdom. "I spent so many years telling Isabella what a mother should be," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet, aching regret. "I never stopped to ask her what kind of mother she wanted to be. Thank you for showing me the difference." The words were a quiet peace treaty, an acceptance not just of Clara's role, but of her own sister's long-silenced truth. Clara's role in the house had solidified, transforming from specialist to the undeniable emotional architect of their new life. Alistair, forever changed by the confrontation with his own grief and his wife's hidden truths, was more present than he had been in his daughter's entire life. He rescheduled international meetings, left the office at a reasonable hour, and made their evening therapy sessions a non-negotiable, sacred part of his day. One evening, as they sat together on the living room carpet, a comfortable silence between them, watching Serafina finally take 3 wobbly, independent steps from the sofa to the ottoman, Alistair reached for Clara's hand without a word. It was a simple, spontaneous gesture, filled with a universe of unspoken gratitude and a burgeoning, tender affection that was both terrifying and exhilarating. He was looking at her not as an employee, not as a savior, but as a partner, an equal. It was in this atmosphere of fragile, growing, and deeply cherished peace that the final storm broke, arriving not with the bang of a dramatic confrontation, but with the quiet, devastating slit of a white, official-looking envelope delivered by a stone-faced courier. It was from the State Physical Therapy Licensing Board. Alistair was there when she opened it. He saw the color drain from her face, saw her hand tremble as she read the single, devastating sheet of paper. "What is it?" he asked, his voice sharp with immediate protective concern. "It's a formal notice," she whispered, her voice barely audible, the paper shaking in her grasp as if it were alive. "My physical therapy license. It's under review for immediate suspension." Alistair took the paper from her, his own eyes scanning the dense, weaponized legalese. The complaint was anonymous, but the allegations were vicious and surgically precise. It accused her of practicing medicine without a license by designing and administering unapproved therapies to a minor child. It cited unethical emotional transference leading to parental alienation. And, most cruelly, it referenced her history of professional negligence resulting in emotional distress for abruptly leaving her previous post after the death of a patient, her sister, Chloe. "This is Catherine," Alistair said instantly, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "She lost in court, so now she's trying to come at you from another, dirtier angle." But Clara slowly shook her head, a sickening, cold certainty dawning in her eyes, a truth she could feel in her bones. "No, this isn't her. The details about my sister, the official diagnosis, the date she died. The records from that hospital are sealed juvenile files. No one knows those details. No one in the world except—" She trailed off, her mind racing back to the very beginning, to the faceless bureaucracy of the placement agency, to the exhaustive, invasive background checks, the confidential files she had been required to submit. Someone had dug into the deepest, most protected, most painful corner of her past and had weaponized her most profound wound against her. The fight wasn't over. It had just found a new, more cruel and personal battlefield. They weren't just trying to take Serafina away from her anymore. They were trying to take away the very core of who she was, the healer, the caregiver. They were trying to tell the world that her gift was, in fact, a crime, and that her love was a form of negligence. The final scene unfolded not in a sterile courtroom or a high-stakes boardroom, but in the quiet, sunlit living room of the estate, a space that had transformed over the last few months from a gallery of grief into a sanctuary of hard-won healing. It had been 3 long, agonizing days since the notice from the licensing board had arrived, 3 days of frantic late-night calls to lawyers, of strategic consultations, and of a gnawing dread that had settled deep in Clara's bones. Alistair had mobilized his entire legal team, a veritable army of the city's best and brightest. But the anonymous complaint was insidious, a venomous ghost they couldn't seem to fight in the open. This morning, he had called an emergency meeting, not with his lawyers, but with the only people who mattered. Clara sat on the plush sofa, a mug of untouched chamomile tea growing cold in her hands. Alistair paced before the fireplace, his movements tight with a restrained, simmering fury. And on the armchair opposite Clara, looking smaller and more fragile than ever, but with a new, clear light in her eyes, sat Catherine Davenport. "I did not file that complaint," Catherine said, as soon as she arrived, her voice clear and devoid of any artifice, her gaze directed squarely and respectfully at Clara. "I know what you must think of me, but my war with you is over. I would never, ever use your family's past against you. That is a line I would not cross." Clara looked at her, and, to her own surprise, she believed her completely. The calculated cruelty of the attack didn't have Catherine's polished, legalistic signature. This was something else. This was gutter fighting. It was then that Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, her face a mask of grave concern, entered the room, her usual impeccable composure slightly frayed. "Sir," she said, her voice low and steady, "there is someone here to see you. He says it's a matter of extreme urgency regarding the licensing complaint." A man stepped into the room behind Mrs. Gable. He was of average height, dressed in a nondescript suit that looked a size too big for his frame, his face a mask of nervous, profuse sweat. It was Mr. Henderson, the perpetually anxious regional manager from the caregiver placement agency. "I had to come," Henderson stammered, his eyes darting around the room, avoiding everyone's gaze. I made a call I shouldn't have. There was pressure." "Pressure from whom?" Alistair demanded, stepping forward, his voice a low growl that made Henderson flinch. Henderson swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. "A board member at my agency. He's also on the board of a major corporate rival of yours, Mr. Finch. A man named Peterson. He heard about Miss Williams, about her success with your daughter. He saw an opportunity." "An opportunity for what?" Clara asked, her own voice dangerously quiet, cutting through Henderson's nervous rambling. "To create a scandal," Henderson admitted, the words spilling out in a desperate, pathetic rush. "To paint you as unstable, your hiring practices as reckless and unorthodox. Peterson wanted to trigger a stock drop, to create an opening for a hostile takeover of your Asian division. He paid me handsomely to dig up your entire confidential file, to find anything that could be twisted. He's the one who filed the anonymous complaint with the board. The ugly, simple, devastating truth landed in the room with a thud. This was never about Serafina's welfare. It was never even about Clara. It was about money. It was about a ruthless corporate predator using a woman's deepest grief and a child's profound vulnerability as collateral damage in a cold, brutal game of power. Clara closed her eyes for a brief moment. The sheer, calculated cruelty of it, the absolute soullessness, was breathtaking. But when she opened them again, there was no fear left. There was only a calm, cold, clarifying fire. "Do you have proof of this?" Clara asked, her voice steady as she looked directly at Henderson. "Does Peterson have any evidence of your conversation?" Henderson nodded miserably, his hand fumbling in his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small, sleek audio recorder. "I record all my sensitive calls," he whispered, his voice thick with shame. "It's a habit, for protection. It's all on here." Alistair took the recorder, his expression hardening into something Clara had never seen before. It was not the face of a grieving father or a humbled CEO. It was the face of a man who was about to burn down an entire empire to protect his own. The rest happened with astonishing, ruthless speed. Alistair's lawyers, armed with the undeniable evidence on the recording, filed for an immediate injunction against the licensing board's review and a multi-million-dollar defamation lawsuit against Peterson and his firm. The board, presented with clear, irrefutable evidence of a malicious, fabricated complaint, threw out the case against Clara within hours, issuing a formal apology and offering to publicly clear her name. By evening, the story had broken across every major financial news network, and Peterson's career, along with his company's stock, was in a spectacular, irreversible free fall. That night, the three of them, Alistair, Clara, and Catherine, sat together in the living room. The fire crackled softly, casting a warm, dancing glow on their faces. Serafina was asleep upstairs, safe, her dreams untroubled. "It's over," Alistair said, his voice filled with a profound, weary relief. "For now," Clara replied softly, a small, wise smile touching her lips. Catherine reached across the space between them and placed a delicate, cool hand on Clara's. "You are an extraordinary woman, Clara Williams," she said, her voice filled with a respect that had been hard-won and was now absolute. "Isabella saw it from the very beginning." Alistair stood and walked to the window, looking out at the glittering, indifferent city. "This house," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "It was just a structure, a beautiful, empty shell. You filled it. You brought the music back in." He turned to face her, his eyes shining with a love that was raw, real, and undeniable. "I know this isn't how these things are supposed to go. I know I don't deserve a second chance, but I can't imagine this life, my life, Serafina's life, without you in it." Clara stood, her heart so full it felt like it might break. She walked toward him, and this time, when he reached for her, she didn't hesitate. He pulled her into an embrace that was not about gratitude or relief, but about a profound, quiet, and deeply earned love. "You didn't just teach her to stand," Alistair whispered into her hair. "You taught me how to live again." A year later, on a warm spring afternoon, a small, intimate group gathered in the estate's newly renovated garden. Greenery bloomed everywhere, a vibrant, fragrant testament to life's stubborn, beautiful persistence. Serafina, now walking and running with a confident, joyful stride, chased a monarch butterfly across the soft green grass. Alistair, holding a small, open velvet box, knelt before Clara. Catherine stood by, dabbing her eyes with a silk handkerchief, her smile genuine and bright. "Clara Williams," Alistair said, his voice clear and full of a joy that was once unimaginable. "You came into my life to care for my daughter. Instead, you saved us both. Will you be my wife? Will you officially be our family?" And Clara, her face wet with happy tears, looked from the man she loved to the little girl who had become her heart, and gave the only answer possible. Yes. The house was no longer silent. It was filled with laughter, and the family, built not on blood, but on the unshakable foundation of courage, trust, and a love that had been tested by fire, was finally, beautifully, and completely whole.